Hello, everyone. My name is Mauro Cozzi. I'm one of the co-founders and CEO of Emitwise. We are a software and technology business entirely focused on how do we help the world's biggest companies get to net zero and drive the change against climate change. And today I'm going to be talking about how businesses around the world are leading the charge on supply chain decarbonization in particular, and why these corporates are taking action and must take action in reaching net zero. Specifically, today I'm going to cover very, very briefly what are supply chain emissions, a very quick crash course on the world of environmental management. I'm going to speak through some of the regulatory changes that are coming across Europe and North America in particular, and therefore why businesses must care about reaching net zero. And I'm going to specifically focus on that concept of supply chain emissions. I'll then walk through a couple examples of what businesses are doing in practice today already to profitably meet net zero. And we'll end exactly with a couple of examples and comments on how actually meeting net zero, becoming a sustainable organization can be good for business, can be profitable. So let's dive right in. First of all, just a very quick overview of what does supply chain emissions even mean. The key concepts to understand here is that carbon footprints, carbon emissions come from everything that a business does, from the day-to-day operations, such as the lights that we use in our offices, if you're a manufacturer, the fuels that you use in your day-to-day processes, but also in your supply chains and your value chains. And that can mean different things for different businesses. If you're a law firm or a financial services firm, your supply chain is mostly, for example, the business travel that you consume when you fly to meet a client, the papers that you use in your photocopiers. Whereas if you're a large automotive manufacturer or food and beverage manufacturer, of course, your supply chain emissions are the raw materials, the ingredients that go into your products, the logistics of moving your products back and forth. And in our world of sustainability, we have these concepts of scopes 1, 2, and 3. And while there's a lot that goes into it, it's the most simple level. What you need to know is that scope 1 is related to the fuel that an organization uses, scope 2 is related to the electricity that an organization uses, and scope 3 is related to everything else, the entire value chain of that business, upstream and downstream. And that's why it's not necessarily surprising that ultimately scope 3 is where most of the carbon footprint of an organization lives, depending on the type of company that you are, your industry and size. Typically, your scope 3 will be anywhere from 80% to 95% of your total carbon footprint. And that's why over the last few years, there has been such an emphasis, such a focus on how can businesses actually address scope 3 emissions in particular. And recently, when we look at the regulatory landscape around environmental reporting and requirements, what you see is that there has been a big focus from regulators on the world of scope 3. And what you need to know as a business leader is that regulation, when it comes to fighting climate change, meeting the Paris Agreement targets, is here already. Across the world, across Europe and North America in particular, by 2025, over 91,000 companies will need to be reporting their environmental impact. That starts with CSRD here in Europe and SEC disclosure requirements set forth in the USA, which have started this year with already a climate change disclosure bill that California has put forward. And scope 3, supply chain emissions reporting, is a key part of all of those regulatory frameworks. And this is really piggybacking off of a general theme that we've seen for now many, many decades, starting with some carbon taxes and emissions trading schemes that were put forward in Europe over 10 years ago, and then spread across the world with hundreds of jurisdictions now having carbon taxes, and now really consolidating in Europe with a new mechanism that essentially says, hey, if you're a European large public organization, you will need to not only disclose your emissions, but also meet targets. And if you're looking to import goods from jurisdictions that don't fall under this regulation, we're actually going to tax those goods to make up for that difference in sort of regulatory requirements from an environmental impact point of view. So in a nutshell, supply chain emissions are a key part of your business, and the regulation is meaning that you really need to start getting a hold of them today. To do a bit of a deeper dive into what's happening in Europe in particular, there's this new regulatory framework called CSRD, which if you haven't already, you will probably be hearing a lot about. In particular, your CFO's office will probably be thinking about CSRD a lot in the next few years and months. And in a nutshell, starting in your 2024 financial reporting year, if you're a large business with an over 30 million euro turnover, or if you're a publicly traded business, you will need to disclose under CSRD everything that is sustainability matters. So that's across environmental sustainability, the carbon footprint that we are talking about here today, but also social and governance matters as well. And the key thing here is that all of this regulation looks a lot like financial disclosure requirements that our businesses are very much used to these days. And these reporting requirements are quite significant and onerous. Just for climate related data points, there are over 200 different data point requirements surrounding what are you going to do from a roadmap to net zero, what initiatives are you putting in place, and actual data-driven evidence that you are meeting those targets that you're communicating to your customers, to regulators, to your consumers as well. There's a concept of double materiality, where you need to look at the impact of both on the environment and on the finances of your business, of both climate change and the initiatives that you're putting in place in order to combat climate change. And so again, the key message here is, as businesses, we now must care about meeting net zero, whether we like it or not, because the regulation is here. And so what we are constantly at Emitwise trying to speak with CFO, CPO, CEOs around is that as a business today, with this knowledge that the regulation is right around the corner, you have an opportunity to either be reactive or proactive. And of course, many of the great businesses of the world have been proactive already for years and decades already, and they're reaping the benefits. And like anything else in business, the benefit of being proactive is really about having that first mover advantage. We think a lot about risk, revenue, and reputation. Risk is typically around losing existing business and not meeting regulatory requirements and getting fined. Revenue is actually around not winning new revenue opportunities which depend on your sustainability credentials. And ultimately, reputation is around the reality that in 10 or 20 years, when being a net zero organization is table stakes, those who got there first will really reap the reputational advantages of having led the charge. But the great news is that we are seeing a large percentage of the world's most significant businesses being proactive rather than reactive. Already nearly 1/3 of global high impact businesses, so these are the largest companies in the world across the Fortune 500, the FTSE 100, are already setting these science-based targets that are verified by a governing body called the SBTi, which is highly trusted. That's over 2,000 companies that have committed to science-based targets, and that by extension commits their entire supply chain to meeting net zero. The number of companies that are setting SBTIs is doubling year on year, and ultimately nearly 40% of the C-suite across those organizations actually are saying that they're finding ways of driving profitability from that transition to net zero, becoming a sustainable organization. So while the need is here, there is a must-have requirement from businesses now to decarbonize, the regulation is here, we're also seeing that those businesses that are being proactive, and luckily for the world it's a large number of them, are actually being able to reap those benefits already. And here's a very specific example for you of an industry where due to the nature of the industry, the change has had to come very quickly, which is the automotive sector. We're seeing some of the big auto players in the world, companies like Toyota, General Motors, and Jaguar and Land Rover, committing publicly to the science-based targets that I told you about just a second ago. And that has a cascading effect where their suppliers, we've spoken to many of the suppliers of these organizations, are telling us that they perceive a very high risk of not taking their own actions, even if they do not directly fall under that regulatory requirement, because they know that their customer is going to put that same pressure that they're getting from the regulatory pressure onto them as a key supplier. Because ultimately, for these businesses that you're seeing here on screen, supply chain emissions are over 94% 5% of their total carbon footprint. So again, examples of businesses that are being proactive, getting ahead of the regulation, and also examples where it's not just the businesses that are directly regulated that need to care, but their entire supply chains as well. And the good news is that ultimately what this is doing is really aligning the needs of the long-term needs of the planet, which is essential for businesses to take into consideration when managing their own long-term risks, supply chain resilience, talent attraction, et cetera, et cetera. And when we align all of those things, we see that ultimately we can help businesses future-proof, but also drive bottom line and top line improvements as well. Essentially align all of the needs of all of the shareholders of a large organization. And our deep belief at Emitwise, now moving forward from, hey, you must care about this as a business. The good news is that businesses are being proactive and finding ways of making it profitable. And so now I will cover, well, how can we find those ways of making this profitable? And our opinion here at Emitwise is that this starts with thinking about carbon footprint management, environmental management, carbon accounting as the new financial accounting. If you think about financial accounting, it's something that while the CFO office owns the numbers, the reporting, the targets, ultimately it's the entire organization that revolves around delivering on those targets and meeting those budgets and meeting those KPIs. And really environmental management is follows the exact same concept, right? While there will be central functions, typically under the CFO and CSO office, that will own the targets that we need to deliver on, it's really down to the entire business to deliver on it. And therefore, we can follow some of the same principles and concepts that we've developed in financial accounting for many, many decades now, which is, first of all, having strong, accurate, reliable, and auditable data is the foundation for any environmental strategy. And organizations need to find ways to implement systems and processes that allow them to really trust their understanding of what is my environmental impact, so then they can put both plans and processes in place to meet environmental targets, but actually ultimately a strategy that delivers on the requirements that are being put forward by regulators and by their customers as well. And so if we take all of these principles of financial management, then we can also think about how we can align different stakeholders that will actually help us deliver on these net zero plans and all of these different requirements. And again, here our philosophy at Emitwise is basically that companies need to simultaneously and with the same data foundation think about how are we going to deliver on compliance, how are we going to meet our reporting requirements, but also use that same data to actually deliver on reductions, reducing scope 3, that supply chain carbon footprint, which is also ultimately the most challenging. And what it comes down to is engaging with your vendors, switching vendors, developing new innovative products, putting in place policies that perhaps minimize business travel to only essential travel, while acknowledging that face-to-face time with clients is a key part of running a business. All of these little nuances that require principles and strategies that are driven by data. And having that data backbone allows you to align all these teams that need to collaborate: finance, procurement, sustainability, operational managers, office managers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's why at Emitwise we think about these two different products that work together, which is using technology and machine learning to automate carbon accounting and reporting and compliance, and help organizations check those checkboxes that are critical for their business to manage these ongoing risks, but actually also delivering tools and analytics and decision-making capabilities so that companies can take those day-to-day decisions to drive supply chain emissions reductions on a day-to-day basis. And ultimately, again, just taking those principles from financial management, it's about embedding that carbon footprint data into the day-to-day decision-making of all different functions, the same way that finance does the same. So if you think today about a marketing function, and when we are running a marketing initiative, thinking about putting advertisements across a city, we're thinking about the return on investment of that initiative, the total cost, We are aligning with what are the sales targets that it's going to need to deliver on. Environmental management must follow the same principles, have that single data point of carbon footprint flow across all different functions so that we can all contribute towards helping our organizations deliver on these new requirements that have been placed upon them. And really, technology is the key enabler of all of this, because at the end of the day, to measure the carbon footprint of every decision that we're doing on an ongoing basis needs to be a highly robust and accurate science-driven exercise that up until today had only been possible to do by really sophisticated, expensive consultants using spreadsheets. And now, thanks to the advent of machine learning and new software technologies, we're able to do those automatically in real time at the point of decision making and on the tools on which we actually work on a day-to-day basis, whether you're a procurement manager working on SAP Ariba or a marketer working on Salesforce, for example. And so that's, my closing thoughts for today is, as a business, you must care about meeting net zero, whether you are directly regulated by CSRD here in Europe or in North America with the upcoming SEC carbon disclosure requirements, or you're actually part of the supply chain of one of those businesses, which inherently means that as a supplier, you will be asked to meet net zero and to report on these environmental metrics. You must care. But the great news is that if you take proactive action, you really can turn this from a regulatory burden and at a cost to your business to actually something that's good for your business. The way that you do that is by having data that is actionable, that you can actually make decisions on, that is auditable, that you can trust on for your reporting, and ultimately that adapts with your business as these regulation requirements become more onerous and evolve over time. And you don't have to take my word for it. Many of our customers at Emitwise have already demonstrated those returns from their environmental strategies, from packaging manufacturers like Pregis to facility managers like Axis, which ultimately what they're finding is they're driving efficiencies, they're reducing their energy bills, they're reducing the amount of waste that their organizations produce, which are good for the bottom line and for their environmental performance. And they're driving top line growth by essentially closing more business, thanks to standing out as a truly green business. So thank you so much for listening today. Again, my name is Mauro Cozzi. We are here with Emitwise, always looking to help businesses profit from this new requirement that is transitioning to net zero. And if you have any questions for us, you can always find me on mauro@emitwise.com. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Mauro. That was an incredibly informative and very detailed presentation. I think your message is very clear to businesses and to our audience joining us today. I wanted to ask you a few questions, starting with going back to when you mentioned that companies will need to report on over 200 climate change related data points. Now, obviously, this sounds quite overwhelming and like it could be a very complex process. So my first question would be, who does this responsibility or this hefty task fall to within the organization?
Yeah, thank you for having me, Joseph, on the contrary. And it can be daunting at first. I would say that I'm seeing two main patterns. I'm seeing organizations that are doing this for the first time or just getting started, typically handing this over to the finance team. I mean, those teams are very sophisticated and knowledgeable on how to align different stakeholders, collect data from across the organization, and set up processes to have transparent reporting. Although in some instances for companies that have already gotten a head start in the last few years or decades, maybe that actually stays within the sustainability function that has better sort of subject matter expertise of this area. So it's typically either of those, either finance or sustainability, Joseph.
And what have you found to be the biggest challenge for them when it comes to trying to come up with their first environmental strategy or reduction strategy?
Yeah, overwhelmingly what we find to be the challenge is actually the data availability. We're finding that, as we all know, right, businesses for a while have now been on digitalization journeys. And ultimately, to report the environmental impact of your business, you need data on everything that you do. The raw materials you buy, the energy you consume, the products that you sell. And for that, you need to gather data from across the organization and to have it in a format that's ready for accounting and for reporting. And so really collaboration between finance, sustainability, and tech and IT is key. And then once you do have your data, I think the next big challenge is to ensure that you have the right ownership and accountability of this new requirement. Like, related to your previous question, right? Hey, is finance going to own this? And then making sure that that team is empowered to meet these requirements.
And I think many businesses will probably have shied away from taking these measures already because they fear that with this comes very high costs. But you did mention that many organizations have already not only taken measures to reduce their carbon footprint, but actually overcome these costs and at the same time increase their profits. How have they done this?
Well, look, I think ultimately the savvy CFO understands that this will be a cost for their business. It's a line item on their P&L, whether they have done that explicitly or not already. It's a financial liability, essentially, because the regulation's coming and there's an inherent cost to get to net zero. You're totally right. However, therefore, it becomes a business case and a time to return on investment question. And the really sophisticated organizations, like if you look at Unilever, in the last few decades have reported that a third of their business growth came from their sustainable living brands. And that's because they were able to be really long-term in their thinking around how are we going to invest today upfront capital on things like putting solar on site that in years to come will actually mean a reduced energy bill, for example, at the end of the day. And don't get me wrong, at the end of the day, we're in a challenged macroeconomic context. There's competing priorities, like cash flow is a key priority for CFOs today. So it's not surprising that it's hard to keep this at the top of the agenda. And so ultimately, the main thing that we see organizations who are succeeding at profiting from this doing is that they do work on the business cases and they find the opportunities. So for example, a customer of ours was able to make a case that there was an increase in the amount of waste that was being produced from their manufacturing operations that they couldn't justify addressing if they were only looking at their margins targets. But when they looked at margins and sustainability targets, then there was a business case for actually addressing that up front. That would mean that they had a reduction in essentially wasted materials and therefore material costs, and an improvement on their sustainability targets as well. So in a nutshell, Joseph, it comes down to making the business case as always and as everything.
And just finally then, could you, I mean, your message, as I said at the beginning, has been very clear throughout that businesses, rather than sitting back and doing nothing, they need to take a proactive approach. Could you just summarize that message to us in perhaps three, action points or keywords?
Yeah, I think, look, it's you have to care, whether you like it or not as a business leader. But don't get stuck on it being daunting. Sure, there's over 200 data points to report on, but you just have to start with one. Understand your environmental impact. And then the main recommendation that I always give to business leaders is find a really great superstar in your leadership team in the right function to own this requirement. It will be a great opportunity for growth for that person because they'll be able to turn it into a competitive advantage for your business. And you'll also have the peace of mind that your business is not at risk of falling behind on regulatory and customer requirements.
Well, thank you once again. It's been incredibly informative and very clear throughout. So thank you for joining us at International Trade Live.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Enjoy the rest of your day.